In this video, I have collected the different interesting World War II jet and rocket planes, which I have already made videos about before. So if someone is interested in them, they can find them in one place. So without further ado, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Fieseler Fi-103R. Most people heard about the late war Japanese kamikaze planes, and some even know the purpose-built Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohka, the so-called Baka bomb. A rocket-powered kamikaze bomb built to be used against the Allied ships. But there was a vehicle not as well known as the Japanese flying bomb, but built in Germany close to the end of the war, with similar purpose and design. This was the Fieseler Fi-103R Reichenberg. So let's see the history of this aircraft. The story of the Reichenberg starts way back in the early 1940s, when the Germans first experimented with the flying bomb, which then became the famous V1, the buzz bomb. Though its earliest roots go back even to 1935, when Paul Schmidt proposed a flying bomb using the pulse jet engine to the Luftwaffe. The project was dismissed then because of the technical difficulties, but in the early 1940s it surfaced again, when Schmidt started working with the Argus company. Argus originally became interested in the unmanned and remote-controlled aircraft in the late 1930s, and with the lead of Fritz Goslar proposed their 292 and later the Fernfeuer design to the Luftwaffe in 1939. After these designs, they started cooperating in 1940 with Schmidt. Their goal was to create an efficient pulse jet engine using the fuel injection from Argus and the shutter system Schmidt developed. The tests of the new engine on automobiles and later on aircraft proved its capabilities, and that it is a viable option to use on unmanned weapons. The first designs for the weapon, which later became the V1, were drawn up in early 1942, when Robert Lasser, a Fieseler engineer, visited Argus. He had a meeting with Goslar, where they proposed a cooperation to build a flying bomb. The plans were soon submitted to the Luftwaffe, and in June the same year, the design for the Fieseler Fi-103 was approved. The engine development and manufacturing was entrusted to Argus, the airframe production to Fieseler, while the work on the guidance system was given to the Ascania company. The first Fi-103 was completed in August 1942, and after a series of glide tests, the first pilot flight happened in December the same year, and in May 1943 they went into production. The production was slow in the first year and only really picked up in 1944. But as the years passed by, the outlook of the war changed, from the German successes in the beginning to a fear of the Allied invasion in the West. And this was the time when the idea of the Fi-103R manned version surfaced. The main targets for these weapons would have been the Allied ships in case of an invasion, and the plan was to aim the aircraft towards the target before the pilot bails out with their parachute in the last possible moment. The chances of survival, however, were very slim for the pilots of these weapons, so they established a separate unit, the so-called Leonidas Squadron, where the volunteers signed a declaration that they fully understood what being part of the squadron means and that their missions will most likely cost them their lives. Initially, two vehicles were considered, one of them the modification of the Fieseler Fi-103, and the other the Messerschmitt Me 328. The 328 was designed as a compact, mostly wooden fighter, which can be manufactured cheaply. It was envisioned with several propulsion types, including jet engines, but the low numbers of those engines meant that they were used for more developed designs, such as the Messerschmitt Me 262 or the Arado 234. You can check my earlier videos if you're interested in the history of those planes. The Me 328 was tested with the pulse jet engines, but soon it ran into problems. As the engines were extremely loud, they caused massive vibrations and uneven thrust, as it was impossible to synchronize the cycles on the two pulse jet engines. The problems eventually led to the dropping of this type, and the attention turned towards modifying the Fi-103. Hitler tasked his favorite commando leader, Otto Skorzeny, to work out plans against the feared Allied invasion. This actually included not just manned flying bombs, but manned torpedoes as well, and the Germans developed several different types of those, alongside of mini-submarines as well. Don't be surprised, but I have a video on those as well. You can find it on the channel. Skorzeny actually pushed the idea of the Fi-103R for some time, but only after the Me 328 was finally dropped was this project considered seriously. The DFS, the same institute that worked on the famous Me-163 rocket fighter, was entrusted to modify the rocket with a cockpit and flight controls for a pilot. The design actually was very similar to the Japanese Ohka, which we mentioned at the beginning, with a large warhead in the nose, a tiny, very rudimentary cockpit, and the engine behind the pilot. The F5-103R was 8 meters long, with a wingspan of just 5.72 meters. It weighed 2,250 kilograms and was powered by an Argo sparse jet engine. It had a maximum speed of 800 kilometers an hour, though this was not limited by the engine, but rather the airframe, and the speed was set for the pilots as never to exceed. The cruise speed of the rocket was 650 kilometers an hour, and it had a range of 330 kilometers, or 32 minutes of flight time. Strangely enough, though we compared the Reichenberg to the Japanese Ohka, there was another Japanese design which was actually very heavily based on the Fi-103R. This was, or rather would have been, the Kawanishi Baika, which was designed but not built before the war ended. The cockpit of the Fi-103R was added in the space where normally the compressed air cylinders were fitted, and the removal of the autopilot system freed up space for those to be moved at the back of the aircraft. This meant the cockpit was immediately in front of the engine air intake, so even though the plan was for the pilot to bail out, this would have been a very complicated and dangerous task. There was one big problem with the Fi-103R project, however. By the time the first modified models were ready, the Allied invasion of France already took place, as the maiden flight of the Reichenberg only happened in September 1944. By this time there was no need for suicide weapons to attack Allied ships, and many felt the project was just a waste of resources. Most of the initial flights ended in crashes as well, until Hannah Rice herself started flying the type to figure out the problem. Eventually the reason for the crashes was identified as pilots trying to land at too low speeds, which is understandable as the original V1 was never designed for landing, just to impact at the end of its flight. During its short lifetime, the Fi-103R had 5 different variants. The R1 was the single-seat unpowered glider for training. The R2 was a 2-man glider version. The R3 was a similar 2-seat but powered variant. The R4 was the standard 1-seat powered model, the one which would have been used for combat missions. And the R5 was used as a trainer for the HG-162 pilots. The type after its development had a very short history, which probably saved the life of many would-be pilots. As only a month after its first flight, in October 1944, when KG-200 received a new commander, Werner Bambach, the project was shelved in favor of the more ambitious Mistral project, which was basically an unmanned plane filled with explosives and piloted from a parasite fighter on its back. I have already mentioned this project in my earlier Ju-88 video, so if you're interested in the topic, check it out. The Reichenberg project was not cancelled yet. Testing and training of the pilots continued until February 1945. But not long after, in March, when during a test flight one of them lost both of the wings, killing the pilot, the project was cancelled for good. Bambach felt this venture went on long enough, and asked Albert Speer to help him convince Hitler to call it off, as suicide attacks are not part of the German warrior tradition. Hitler agreed, and the unit was disbanded the same day, and none of the converted rockets went into combat. The history of the German suicide rocket ended before it could have claimed any lives on the Allied side. Though the Fieseler Fi-103R was just a short-lived, desperation-born suicide weapon, developed too late and produced in small numbers, it is still an interesting part of World War II. Chapter 2: The Messerschmitt Me-163. The only operational rocket-powered fighter plane in history, the famous Me-163. It was one of the late war German wonder weapons, and the first aircraft that exceeded 1,000 km an hour in level flight. It was an interesting design, so let's see how and why it was built. In the late 1930s, there was an increasing interest in the rocket-powered airplane designs in Germany, similarly to the jet engines. The rocket engines offered great performance for a fighter plane, but their short burn time and high fuel consumption was a problem. To counter this, a plane with good gliding capabilities was needed, so it can return to the airfield without engine power. The German Research Institute for Gliding Flight was ordered to build a prototype of the Lippisch Delta IV to test rocket engines. This glider was an unconventional design from Dr. Alexander Lippisch, with no tail and featuring large delta wings. Under the program it was renamed the DFS-39. During the development, Lippisch became concerned that the DFS-39's wing-mounted control surfaces will cause problems at high speeds. They redesigned the plane, keeping the overall shape and large swept wings, but with a single vertical stabilizer on the tail. This new design was named the DFS-194. The original plan was DFS will produce the wings for the aircraft and Heinkel prepares the airframe, but the project suffered from delays and DFS couldn't keep the projected dates. Dr. Lippisch became frustrated and requested that he and his team with the whole project to be transferred to Messerschmitt and continue the work there. The Air Ministry granted his request in January 1939. Though the DFS-194 originally was planned to be a conventional piston-powered aircraft, just as a testbed for later rocket-powered designs, but after the project was moved to Messerschmitt, it was decided the aircraft will be developed as a rocket-powered machine only. The first airframe was completed in early 1940 and was moved to Peenemünde for the installation of the rocket engine and for test flights. The prototype showed excellent flight characteristics and reached 342 miles an hour in level flight. The success of the DFS-194 gave the project a big boost. The first prototype built by Messerschmitt, now renamed Me-163A V1, was completed in early 1941 and began its test flights during the summer. The first tests were just unpowered glide tests. After those, it had its rocket engine installed for powered flights. Though the rocket engines were not very reliable, in October 1941 the V1 prototype exceeded the 1000 km/h level flight speed, setting a new speed record. The performance of the aircraft impressed the ministry so much that they immediately instructed Lippisch to design an upgraded version accommodating a new, more powerful rocket engine that was in development at that time. The work on the Me-163B version started in December 1941. Though the main goal was simplifying the construction for large-scale production, the plane actually ended up as a complete redesign compared to the A model. The main visual differences are a different canopy, the more sloped-top fuselage, and the more pointy nose incorporating a turbine to supply electricity while in flight. The first 30 pre-production Me-163B-0 models were equipped with 20mm cannons. The production variant, the Me-163B-1, featured the 30mm Mk108 cannons, the same weapon that was used on the Me-262 jet fighters. After the B model, there were more upgrades planned for the Me-163, mainly aimed at better fighter performance and longer combat time. The C model featured a bubble canopy for better visibility, a longer fuselage with larger fuel tank which increased the power time to 12 minutes, and a pressurized cockpit so the maximum altitude was raised to 15,850 meters. There was only one prototype built. In 1944 the project was moved to Junkers, where an improvement program was started. The newly planned aircraft featured a retractable tricycle landing gear and even more powerful twin-chamber rocket engines. The result was the Ju-248, which was then renamed Messerschmitt Me-263 when the project was moved back to Messerschmitt. This aircraft never reached production as the war ended, but its plans ended up in Soviet hands and served as a base for the Mikoyan Gurevich I-270. The Germans supplied the Japanese Empire with the Me-163 plans and a fully built plane as well. This inspired the Mitsubishi G8M rocket plane. Several variants were built by the Japanese, and in August 1945 the design was finalized and a full-scale production was almost ready to start, but the war ended, so this Japanese rocket plane never saw action. Although the Me-163 performance was amazing, the rocket engines were still highly unreliable and very dangerous, partly because of the very corrosive and flammable fuel, the so-called C-stuff, and the oxidizer called T-stuff. Because of the failing of fuel lines or other problems, many times the aircrafts caught fire while refueling or when the engine was started. Refueling the Me-163 was a very dangerous task. The fuel and the oxidizer were always delivered in separate tankers. The two vehicles never stayed in the vicinity of the aircraft together or even close to each other. First the truck carrying the fuel approached the aircraft, filled it up, then they left the area. Just after that, the other tanker carrying the oxidizer approached and started the refueling process. All the equipment and the plane's fuel system had to be rinsed after use because of the highly corrosive nature of these materials. An interesting design choice was, to save weight, the Me-163 didn't have an undercarriage. It took off with a jettisonable set of wheels and used a skid for landing. This landing skid was also a problematic part of the aircraft, as sometimes it failed on landing, resulting in pilot injuries or worse, the overturning of the aircraft, which could cause explosion or fires. Another drawback of the skid was the aircraft became immobile after landing. Because the planes couldn't move after landing, the ground crews needed special tractors to retrieve them. Several different types of these vehicles were used. They all served the same purpose, lifting the aircraft and carry it back to the hangars. Some of them used hydraulics to lift the aircraft. Others relied on compressed air to lift the fighter off the ground. The Me-163 had great performance for a trade-off of only 8 minutes of fuel on board. It could exceed the speed of 1000 km an hour, though because of control surface compression, it was not recommended to exceed 900 km an hour. Its rate of climb was unbelievable for the time, at 81 meters per second. For a comparison, the P-51 Mustang's climb rate was 16 meters per second. From a standing start, it could reach altitudes of 6000 meters or 20,000 feet in less than 2.5 minutes, and 10,000 meters or 33,000 feet in less than 3.5 minutes. The usual method for the Me-163 combat mission was to take off, level out the aircraft and reach around 700 km an hour, which was the plane's best climbing speed, then climb at 70° angle to the target bomber formation's altitude. When reaching the altitude, accelerate to around 850 km an hour. The Me-163 was equipped with two 30mm Mk108 cannons, which was a devastating weapon, but it had low muzzle velocity, so aiming was very hard. The Me-163 pilots had the same difficulties as the ones flying the Me-262 using the same guns. The speed difference between these fighters and the target bombers was huge, so the pilots only had a few seconds to aim their shots, which combined with the low velocity cannons made the attacks very challenging. I already mentioned this and how these fighters attacked the bomber formations in my earlier Me-262 video as well. So if you haven't seen that, I recommend you watch it. See the link in the description or at the end of this video. To test the Me-163, the first service test unit, Erprobungskommando 16, was established late 1942 under the command of Wolfgang Spate. They received their first A model aircrafts in July 1943. The first B models were assigned to this unit in January 1944, and the unit was considered combat ready in May, when they started flying small-scale combat actions against Allied bombing formations. Following these combat trials, the first Luftwaffe Me-163 fighter wing was formed officially. The first combat action of this new fighter wing occurred on 28th of July 1944, when they attacked the B-17 formation. The Allied fighter pilots were stunned by the sheer speed of the Me-163 at first. But after a while, they found the German plane's weakness, the very short powered flight time. After the Allied pilots learned about the faults of these new planes, they usually didn't try to attack them directly. Instead, they waited and attacked them in their gliding phase or after landing. By the end of 1944, the fight having received 91 Me-163 fighters, but most of them were grounded because of the lack of fuel. The initial plan was to station numerous Me-163 wings around Allied targets, but by the end of the year it was clear this can't be realized due to lack of resources. The fighter wing flew combat missions up until early 1945, but then the Me-163 operations were stopped altogether. Most of their pilots were redirected to Me-262 flights. The Me-163 Comet was not an operational success. It could have worked if used as originally planned, launching a large number of planes against the enemy formations, but at the end of the war, Germany didn't have the resources to use them as they were planned. The Allied nations captured several Me-163s at the end of the war. They tested them, but only in glider mode, as it was deemed too dangerous to test them with the rocket engine. The only exception was a flight by Captain Eric Brown, British Chief Naval Test Pilot. This flight was unofficially conducted in Germany with the help of a cooperating German ground crew on 17th of May 1945. Captain Brown actually signed a disclaimer for the German crew, as they feared retaliation if anything would happen to Brown in the test flight. Despite the fears, the flight went smoothly, and Captain Brown reached 32,000 feet altitude in just 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Later he described the flight as like being in charge of a runaway train. This was the only powered Me-163 flight after the end of the war. As with most of the late war German wonder weapons, the Me-163 was a great technological feat, but it was too little too late to have any impact on the outcome of the war. Chapter 3: The Heinkel HE-280. Almost everyone knows the Messerschmitt Me-262 as the first operational jet fighter aircraft developed during World War II in Germany. But the Me-262 was not the first jet fighter in history. There was another plane developed at the same time and flew before the Messerschmitt one, but it fell victim to technical problems, lack of resources and political decisions. This was the Heinkel HE-280. So let's see how this historical aircraft was developed and why it didn't go to large-scale production. Let's first take a look how the jet engine development gained momentum between the two world wars, and what led to the development of the jet fighter aircrafts. The limited efficiency of the propeller was a concern for engineers well before World War II, and that meant the propeller-driven planes will reach their limits fairly soon. The experiments with jet engines started back in the 1920s, though the propeller-driven planes were getting faster and better all the way until the end of World War II. While in a modern real jet engine the compressor is driven by the engine itself, in the early prototype jets the compressor was driven by a separate piston engine. These hybrid engines were called motorjets. A good example of these early hybrid experiments is the Caproni Campini N1, which started development in 1934. Frank Whittle, the man known as the pioneer of the jet engine, drew up his first idea in 1928 and patented it in 1930. About the same time, when Frank Whittle was working on his turbojet engine in Britain, there were similar experiments in Germany by Hans von Ohain. He was working on his jet engine project through the 1930s and finished the first test run in September 1937, just a few weeks after Whittle's engine. Ohain's engine followed a centrifugal design, contrary to the later Junkers Jumo and BMW jets, which were axial designs. The centrifugal design allowed for an overall smaller engine, but the output of them were below the expectations. In 1936, Ohain had a meeting with Heinkel engineers after approaching the company with his plans, and managed to convince them that with enough resources, the engine can be refined and used in mass production. So from April 1936, Ohka started working for Heinkel to develop his jet engine design further. A version of his engine powered the world's first jet aircraft, the Heinkel HE-178, in August 1939, just a few weeks before the invasion of Poland. Encouraged by the successful test, the Germans started working on the idea of an advanced combat aircraft powered by jet engines. Though the Heinkel jet flight was a milestone in aviation, it didn't spark much interest in the RLM. As later turned out, the ministry already started their own jet project. A big part in this negativity towards Heinkel's work came from his differences with some high-ranking Nazis, and because he often criticized the regime. While Willy Messerschmitt, on the other hand, was popular in the party. Despite no backing from the state, Heinkel started working on a new high-speed fighter aircraft, featuring Ohka's engine. This is the aircraft which became the AG-280. The design team under the lead of Robert Lasser, who was a co-designer of the famous Bf-109, set to work in late 1939, and they made good use of the data and experience gathered with the AG-178, though the design of that plane was not developed further. It was a good proof of concept for jet propulsion, but it was not suitable for a high-speed fighter plane. The design of the new aircraft was similar to the Me-262 in a sense that it mounted the engines under the wings, but the design itself was fairly conventional, featuring straight semi-elliptical wings and a twin tail. Later the V8 prototype was tested with a very unique V-shaped tail design. The AG-280 featured a tricycle landing gear from the beginning, which initially met some resistance, as many thought this kind of landing gear is too fragile for the airfields. But as it turned out, they were wrong. Though it was a conventional design, the AG-280 had one very new device on it. It was the very first plane to feature an ejection seat, which was powered by compressed air. The first airframes were ready by summer 1940, but the engine development was lagging behind. The aircraft was planned to use Hans von Ohka's design, but as most jet engine development at that time, they encountered problems. Because of this, until early 1941, the test flights were performed in glider mode. The AG-280 was 34 feet 1.5 inches long, with a wingspan of 40 feet. It had an empty weight of 7,073 pounds, and it was powered by two AGS-8A turbojet engines. With these engines it could maintain 510 miles an hour and reach 560 miles an hour for short periods of time. It had a range of 400 miles and an estimated service ceiling of 37,700 feet. The planned armament was 3 MG-151 20mm cannons. Finally, at the end of March 1941, the engines were ready and the first powered flight happened. This flight made the AG-280 the first jet fighter aircraft in the world, as the Me-262 only performed its first jet-powered flight in July 1942. The plane handled well, and the prototypes had several test flights in the coming year. But the engines were still troublesome and not powerful enough. In January 1943, one of the prototypes was tested to use fast jet engines from the Viva rockets. But the test didn't end well. Because of the bad weather, the control surfaces iced up, and the plane crashed. The test pilot had to use the ejector seat, becoming the first ever pilot using such a device. Over the following year, the progress on the development was slow and mainly spent on refining the engines. Finally, at the end of December 1942, the AG-280 demonstrated itself with the refined engines against Focke-Wulf 190s, and it proved to be a lot faster than the propeller-driven fighters. The RLM after this demonstration finally showed some interest in the fighter, and placed an order for 20 pre-production aircraft. But the engine problem still delayed the Heinkel project. In 1942, the RLM instructed Heinkel to cease work on the existing engines, as they were too underpowered, and concentrate on the new model, the AGS-11, which was an interesting design, combining axial and centrifugal compressor elements. As the new engine's development was even more complicated than its predecessors, in 1943 the V6 prototype was tested with UMO jet engines, and worked well enough, but the UMO engines were much bigger and heavier than the ones the plane was designed for, so this prototype was much slower than the Me-262. If you're interested in the history of the Me-262, I already made a video on that, so I recommend you check it out. See the link in the description or at the end of this video. As it seemed the Heinkel engines will not be in production anytime soon, finally in March 1943 Heinkel was ordered to stop the project, as the ministry didn't want two competing designs for the limited number of jet engines. The Heinkel HE-280 was one of the history's almost happened vehicles. It could have been a good aircraft and maybe even get in service earlier than the Messerschmitt Me-262, but the development troubles, the time wasted on the engines, and the politics in the Air Ministry finally put an end to its short history. Chapter 4. The Yokosuka MXY-7. In the last year of World War II, the Japanese Empire had many desperate attempts to try to slow down or stop the American push over the Pacific Islands. One of these desperation-born weapons was the Yokosuka MXY-7, a rocket-powered suicide plane, a flying bomb which the pilot tried to crash into American warships. To understand the reason behind the development and use of suicide planes in World War II on the Pacific theater, we need to go back a few years to the first big carrier battles. During the war in the Pacific, the large-scale carrier battles, like the Battle of Midway, badly damaged the Imperial Japanese Air Service. Many experienced and well-trained air crews were lost in these battles. Even before the actual kamikaze units were formed, some pilots chose to crash their planes in enemy warships if it was badly damaged and they had no chance of returning home. As the war progressed, the losses on the veteran air crews during the Battle of Solomon Islands campaign mounted to a point where it was impossible to replace them with other combat experienced men. In the second part of World War II, the Japanese Navy Air Service also lost the upper hand in plane performance, as the new American planes, like the F-4U Corsair and the F-6F Hellcat, outperformed their Japanese counterparts. By June 1944, in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, both the Japanese aviators and their planes were surpassed by the Americans. The Japanese forces lost more than 400 carrier-based planes and pilots in the battle, which the Allied side just called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The first proposals of using kamikaze tactics were mentioned around this time. It's unclear where and when the first deliberate kamikaze attacks happened, but Rear Admiral Masafumi Arima is usually credited as the inventor of kamikaze tactics. Arima himself led an attack against USS Franklin at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where he was killed, but USS Franklin was badly damaged. The Special Attack Force Kamikaze carried out their first mission in October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. They managed to damage several Allied ships and achieved their greatest success when an A6M0 crashed into USS Cello and its bomb caused a magazine explosion, which led to the sinking of the carrier. If you guys are interested in more great footage like this, check my video about the kamikaze attack on USS Ticonderoga. See the link in the description. These early successes led to the expansion of the kamikaze program. That's when the Japanese started to look for purpose-built kamikaze aircrafts instead of converted fighter planes. The first idea for such a plane came from ensign Mitsuo Ota in 1943, and a year later the actual blueprints were created at the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal. The planned usage of the aircraft was to be delivered close to the target area by a bomber, then released. It featured a 1200 kg warhead and 3 solid fuel rockets, which helped it reach around 400 miles an hour in level flight and around 600 miles an hour in the final dive. This made it extremely hard to defend against these weapons after they were released from their mother aircraft. This led to the Allied tactics of extending the defense rings around the carrier forces, and the American fighters focusing on attacking the bombers carrying these suicide planes. The idea came from Commander John Tetch, and in a sense called for larger patrol groups to operate further away from the carriers. Another part of the defense was a line of destroyers at least 80 kilometers out from the main fleet body to provide early radar warning and coordination screen for the patrol aircrafts. The extended range defense worked well against these suicide planes, as they couldn't release early because of their extremely short operational range, which was only 37 kilometers, and the slow bombers carrying them were easy targets for Allied fighters. Later versions were designed to be able to launch from land or from submarines using a catapult, though they were never used like that in the end. The only operational version used in combat was the Model 11. The K1 was the trainer version. It was built in 1 or 2-seater, glider or rocket-assisted variant. The Model 22 was an upgrade over the Model 11, designed to overcome the very short range of the rocket-powered version. It featured thermojet engines and used a smaller 600 kg warhead. 50 were built in 1945, but they were never used in combat. There were other more advanced versions planned, featuring folding wings and jet engines, but the end of the war stopped these plans. The Ohka was mainly used in the Battle of Okinawa against the Allied ships. In April 1945, the Japanese forces intensified the Ohka attacks. On 1st of April, 6 G4M bombers carrying Ohkas attacked the US fleet stationed at Okinawa. At least one of them was successful and caused damage to the battleship West Virginia. On the 12th of April, 9 bombers attacked the fleet. This time they were more successful. The US destroyer Meteor was hit, broke in two, and sank. Another destroyer, the Jeffers, managed to shut down an Ohka, but the explosion from about 50 yards from the ship was strong enough to cause so much damage the destroyer had to be withdrawn for repairs. The destroyer Stanley was hit by an Ohka, but the huge warhead completely passed through the hull and exploded in the water. Another Ohka barely missed the Stanley, and the explosion in the water was so strong it knocked out the ship's engine. Later attacks in the same month were mostly unsuccessful and caused no damage. In the next month, May 1945, again several Ohka kamikaze attacks occurred. 3 of the US destroyers were damaged, but no major loss was suffered. In general, the Ohkas made little impact in the war, or even in the Battle of Okinawa, as they were not effective enough, especially against the extended Allied defense operations around the fleets. They were just one of those last-ditch efforts which tried to delay the inevitable defeat. Chapter 5. The Arado AR-234. The plane which only flew at the last year of the war, it was more rare and just as fast as the famous Me-262. Though it was not a game changer that late in the war, especially in such low numbers, but its high-tech design and unparalleled speed was quite a shock for the Allies. So let's see how the world's first jet-powered bomber, the Arado AR-234, was developed. The origins of the world's first jet-powered bomber are reaching back to the 1930s, when the first actually usable jet engines started to appear. Even between the two world wars, some engineers were already concerned that even though the aircrafts became more and more advanced, the propeller-driven design will soon reach its maximum potential. Though up until the end of World War II, and even some time after, the propeller-driven planes became faster and better, it was clear the jet propulsion will be the future. The first jet engine designs were kind of hybrids, where the air compressor was driven by an external piston engine, as opposed to a rear jet engine where the compressor is driven by the engine itself. A good example for these early hybrid experiments is the Caproni Campini N1. The work on the turbojet engine started in both Germany and in England around the same time. The British Frank Whittle, who already patented the turbojet engine in 1930, was the first who managed to demonstrate an actual working prototype. But in Germany, Hans von Ohain's engine was also running just 6 months after Whittle's. A version of this engine powered the world's first jet aircraft, the Heinkel HE 178, 2 years later, in 1939, not long before the German invasion of Poland and the start of World War II. While at first the new technology didn't find much interest in Britain, the Germans saw a lot of potential in it. Many people think the German jet-powered aircraft were just last-effort weapons because they appeared at the end of the war, but many designs actually started before World War II and were already in advanced stages in the early 1940s. The Heinkel HE 280, which was the first jet-powered fighter plane of the world, was already built by 1940, and only delays in engine development pushed its first flight back to 1942. Or the first operational jet fighter, the Me-262, which was in development since 1939 and already made test flights in 1942. If you want to know more about the history of the Me-262 and why the Heinkel fighter didn't make it to production, I've already made a video on that topic, so I recommend you watch that. See the link in the description or at the end of this video. Similarly, the AR-234 development started early in World War II, in late 1940, when the German Ministry of Aviation announced a tender for a new jet-powered reconnaissance aircraft. Interestingly, only the Arado company entered, with their E370 project, which was designed under the lead of Walter Bloom. The planned aircraft was a fairly conventional design, with high-mounted straight wings, a sleek aerodynamic fuselage, mounting two UMO 004 engines on the wings. The ministry originally asked for more than 2,000 km of range for the aircraft, and while the Arado design's estimated range was below that, the other qualities were promising, so two prototypes were ordered. The estimated maximum speed of the E370 was 780 km an hour, with a service ceiling of 11,000 meters and a range just shy of 2,000 kilometers. The prototypes were finished in less than a year before the end of 1941, but similarly to the other German jet planes, the bottleneck of their development and manufacturing was a delay in the jet engines. The first flight-ready engines for this new plane only arrived 1.5 years later, and the V1 prototype's first flight finally took place in July 1943. Later the same year in October, the second prototype crashed after an engine fire. But when the third prototype was shown to Adolf Hitler, he was so impressed he authorized the company to gear up for large-scale manufacturing of the plane. To maximize fuel capacity and give the plane the intended range, the designers opted to use a similar trolley for takeoffs and skids for landing as on the Me-163 rocket plane, which I already made a video about, so if you're interested in the history of that plane, you can check out that video as well. The trolley used for takeoffs was attached to the skids on the aircraft, so the pilot could steer it. After liftoff, the trolley was jettisoned and slowed down by its own brake parachute. The first 5 prototypes were built with this setup. The plan was to use the trolley for takeoffs, and for landings have skids under the fuselage and the engine nacelles. The landings usually went smoothly with the skids, but the pilot had no way of steering or braking after touchdown. The plane also became immobile after stopping and cannot taxi, so it prevented other aircraft to land or take off until it was recovered. On later models, the skid landing gear was dropped. Instead, they received a retractable tricycle landing gear, and the designers tried other ideas to increase fuel capacity. One was the conventional external fuel tanks, suspended under the engines. The other attempted solution was anything but conventional. The engineers designed a flying fuel tank for the plane, which was towed behind and carried additional fuel for the flight. The 6th and 8th prototypes were fitted with 4 BMW engines instead of the UMO ones. They both featured different configurations though. The 6 had the 4 engines mounted individually, while the 8 had them in twin nacelles on both wings. In 1942, the Air Ministry asked Arado to design a bomber version of the plane, so the V7 prototype was used for developing that variant. Though it sounds good to have a very fast jet bomber, the Arado was not the best choice for that. It was a small aircraft, only 12.6 meters long, with a 14.4 meters wingspan. The width of the fuselage varied between 1.4 and 1.9 meters and was filled mostly with fuel tanks and a crammed one-man cockpit. The V9 and V10 were the prototypes for the AR-234B, the bomber version, and the first ones to feature the final retractable landing gear setup. Since the plane's small fuselage had no space for internal bomb bays, the bombs were carried on external racks, under the engines and the fuselage, but this greatly improved drag and reduced the speed of the aircraft. The V13 had 4 BMW engines, similarly to the V8 version, but featured the retractable landing gear setup. This variant was the base for the AR-234C version. The V16 was a development model to test the new swept crescent wings. The wings were tested in the wind tunnel, and they were actually constructed, but never fitted on the plane. The AR-234A was the first proposed production variant, still featuring the skid-type landing gear. The B1 variant was a reconnaissance version. It was used to take pictures after the Normandy landings in August 1944. While the B2 became the bomber version, which could carry a maximum of 1,500 kilograms of bomb load. During the test flights, the V9 prototype reached 672 km/h maximum speed, while carrying three 500 kg bombs. When carrying the maximum payload, rocket boosters were often used under the wings to help with the takeoff. Two planes from the B-2 versions were converted to night fighters, featuring the Neptune radar and 20mm cannons. In February 1945, production switched to the C models, which used 4 BMW engines, so the UMO engines will free up for the Me-262 production. They also featured a redesigned cockpit. The C-1 became the reconnaissance version, while the C-2 the bomber version. There was also a C-3 variant, mounting two 20mm cannons under the nose. There were numerous proposed designs which never went to production as the war ended. Some of them were quite interesting. One idea proposed to carry a V-1 flying bomb on top of the aircraft and air launch it against Allied targets, or tow it behind the aircraft like the earlier mentioned flying fuel tank proposal. Another idea was mounting a microfighter under the fuselage, which the mother aircraft would carry near Allied bomber formations to attack them. Now let's see the general technical specifications of the most common B-2 variant. As we mentioned earlier, the AR-234, all things considered, was a very small plane. It was 12.6 meters long, with a wingspan of 14.4 meters. It was powered by two UMO 004 turbojet engines, or 4 BMW engines on the C variants. The plane could reach a maximum speed of 742 km/h at 6,000 meters, and had a cruise speed of 700 km/h. The later C variant was even faster, it could reach 870 km/h. It had a range of 1,556 km with a full bomb load, and a service ceiling of 10,000 meters. The plane had a maximum bomb load of 1,500 kilograms. The usual loadout was either two 500 kg bombs under the engines or one 1,000 kg bomb under the fuselage. Optionally, it could carry an unpowered bomb torpedo, the BT-1400. The AR-234 had lots of trouble getting into operational status, as even though it was ready by 1944, the German war industry was crippled by that time by Allied bombings. The shortage of resources led to drop in quality in manufacturing, which hit especially hard the sensitive jet engines. The engines usually required rebuilding after just 10 hours of operation, and even when they were available, the lack of fuel grounded many aircraft. The first mission of the AR-234 was conducted in August 1944, flying reconnaissance over the Allied positions in Normandy and collecting information over England. Later in that year, the B variant started to arrive to the units, and they flew bombing missions against Antwerp and Brussels. They flew missions against Allied targets in the Battle of the Bulge, and some of them attacked Bastogne in January 1945. Their most numerous and famous mission was trying to bomb the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen when the Allies captured it. For more than a week the Germans tried to demolish the bridge, with bombing missions including the AR-234s and V-2 rocket strikes. The jet bombers flew missions up until the end of the war, though many of them were grounded because lack of fuel. The speed of these new aircrafts was a surprise to the Allies, as no Allied fighter could catch them unless they made a turn and dropped their speed. But soon the Allied pilots started to use the same tactics against them as they did against the Me-262 and the Me-163, and attacked them during landing or taking off when they were vulnerable. At the end of the war, several of these planes were captured by the Allies. 3 of them, together with other aircraft, were transported to the US aboard HMS Reaper during Operation Lusty. Today only one surviving plane is known, which is on display at the Smithsonian. Chapter 6. The Gloster Meteor. The Gloster Meteor, though it was not the first jet fighter in service, it was the first in squadron service, and the only Allied jet fighter that saw combat during World War II. Today we will take a look at its history and development, and talk about what were the problems that led to the delays and almost the cancellation of the project. While the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt Bf-109 fought above Europe to decide who will rule the skies, in the background a secret race took place for new technologies and to gain an edge in development of the jet engine and the jet-powered aircrafts. To be able to see the full picture, we will have to go back a few years in time to the pre-war years, when the jet engine development started. The limited efficiency of the propeller was a concern for engineers well before World War II. They foreseen that the propeller-driven planes will reach their limits fairly soon. The experiments with jet engines already started back in the 1920s, though the propeller-driven planes were getting faster and better all the way until the end of World War II. Frank Whittle, the man who known as pioneer of the jet engine development, drew up his first idea in 1928, and had a working prototype and completed test runs on it in April 1937. About the same time when Whittle was working on his engine in Britain, there were similar experiments in Germany by Hans von Ohka. He was working on his jet engine project through the 1930s and finished the first test run in September 1937, just a few months after Whittle's engine. The race was on who will put the jet engines to use first, and the Germans gained the lead in 1939 as the world's first jet aircraft, the Heinkel HE 178, made its first flight powered by one of Ohka's engines in August, just a few weeks before the invasion of Poland. By 1941, the German development entered its next phase, as their jet fighter prototypes made test flights already, though only in glider mode. But not long after, in the next year, they performed jet-powered flights as well. And when I say prototypes, I mean more than one type, as even before the famous Messerschmitt Me 262 performed its maiden flight, another German jet fighter, the Heinkel HE 280, already flew using jet engines. I already made videos on both of these aircrafts, so if you're interested in the history of the Me 262 and want to know more about the Heinkel HE 280 and why it didn't go to large-scale production, check out these videos too. You can find the link in the description or at the end of this video. The Germans gained a big advantage, as it took the British years to get to their first jet-powered flight, which only happened in 1941, with the Gloster E-2839. And with that we arrived to the British side of jet development, which in my opinion was a great example of overcomplicating and mismanaging things in the usual British way, which pushed the later Meteor project to the brink of cancellation. Though Frank Whittle worked on his jet engine through the 1930s, the government was not really interested in his work until the war broke out. His ideas were mostly dismissed earlier, and the development was in a constant struggle for funding. But finally in 1939 they received another visit from the Air Ministry, and Whittle managed to run his prototype engine for 20 minutes without any problems as a demonstration, which convinced many of the visitors. The ministry agreed to buy the prototype and placed an order for a flyable version of the engine. They also issued specification E-2839 and started talks with the Gloster company for an experimental aircraft to test the engine as a proof of concept. Whittle soon visited the Gloster company, where he met with George Carter, the chief designer. They closely worked together, and Carter soon laid out plans for the aircraft. It was a conventional design, with the Whittle WWII jet engine in the center, the intake in the nose, a tricycle undercarriage, and a single fin tail. The first prototype flew in May 1941 and proved that the jet aircraft is a working concept. While the E-2839 was in development, the ministry already issued another specification in 1940 for a jet-powered fighter aircraft. By August 1940, George Carter presented the initial plans for the aircraft, which because of the low power of the early engines was a twin-engine design. The plans were soon approved and 2 prototypes were ordered. However, the British were not immune to the problems the Germans faced developing their jet aircrafts. They also had to realize that the problem is not the airframe, but the engines. The turbojet engine was developed by Whittle's company, Power Jets Limited, but this was a small company with no manufacturing capacity. So the Air Ministry recommended them to work together with the Rover car company to develop and manufacture the WWII engine. But this cooperation was anything but smooth. Rover's engineers made changes to the design behind Whittle's back. and the communication between the two companies completely broke down over time. The disagreements and differing views on development in the end resulted in almost 2 years wasted, with basically no progress on the W2 engine. The ministry became so frustrated with the delays that they put a stop on the development, but later this was reversed. They still reduced the order to 6 prototypes, and the Meteor project was still on the edge to be cancelled altogether. The Air Ministry actually issued another specification to replace the Meteor project. Specification E542 called for a single-engine fighter using the de Havilland H1 engine, which was developed from the early Whittle design by Frank Halford. The result was the Gloster E144 design called Ace, which in the end didn't go to production, but later its tail section was used on the Meteor F8 models. But luckily for the Meteor project, Ernest Hives, the head of Rolls-Royce, stepped in the picture. Rolls-Royce manufactured the famous Merlin engines during World War II, and actually their engineers were working on jet technology since 1939 as well. Hives invited Spencer Wilkes, the head of Rover, for a dinner, and made a business proposal. Rolls-Royce takes over the jet engine project, and in exchange gives them their tank engine factory. Rolls-Royce wanted to build jet engines, as they saw it as the future. Long story short, the deal was made, and Rolls-Royce took over the project. They assigned around 2,000 people on it, and by January 1943, they worked out most of the problems. While all this happened, in the background the work at Gloster continued, and taxiing trials were carried out during 1942 with the Meteor prototypes. These prototypes used the Rover W2 engines, but they were too underpowered to fly. The first flight happened on 5th of March 1943. But since the Rolls-Royce made engines were not yet ready, it used the engines Frank Halford developed. This engine served as a basis for the later Goblin engine used in the de Havilland Vampire fighters. The first flight with the Rolls-Royce W2 engines happened in June 1943. The first production Meteor F1 flew on 12th of January 1944. It was basically identical to the prototypes, except the armament, which was 4 20mm Hispano cannons. Though the original specification asked for 6 cannons, the installation of the last 2 would have made the space in the nose so cramped that the service and removal of the guns would have been very complicated or outright dangerous for ground crews. The first production aircraft was actually soon exchanged with the United States for a Bell YP-59 Aerocomet, so both countries can evaluate the other's plane. I have already made a video on the Bell P-59, so if you're interested in that, I recommend you watch it. Originally 300 units of the F1 models were ordered, but during production most of them were converted to upgraded models, as during the manufacturing many small changes were implemented. Now let's see the main variants of the Meteor. The F1 was the first production batch, only 20 were built. This variant had no air brakes and used the original canopy, which opened sideways. One of the F1s was later converted for the Rolls-Royce turboprop development program. The F2 variant was an experimental version with the Halford engines. It didn't go to production because this would have interfered with the Goblin engines production, which was needed for the Vampire fighters. The F3 variant was the first to be built in large scale. The first 15 units still used the original Welland engines, based on Whittle's design. But the rest was built with the Rolls-Royce developed Derwent engines, which was a straight-through design, replacing the original reverse-flow Whittle engines. They also featured an upgraded sliding canopy and increased fuel capacity. The last 15 aircraft were built with the longer engine nacelles, which improved on the buffeting and increased the maximum speed by 75 miles an hour. From this variant 210 units were built. The next F4 variant received the stronger Derwent 5 engines, which was a scaled-down version of the Rolls-Royce Nini engines. This was a serious upgrade, as compared to the engines in earlier models, which produced 1,700 and 2,000 pounds of thrust. This engine produced 3,500 pounds. Other upgrades on this variant were redesigned wings, pressurized cockpit, and underwing hardpoints to carry rockets and bombs. 489 were built, and exported to many countries, including Argentina, Belgium, Denmark, Egypt, and the Netherlands. The F5 was an experimental reconnaissance version. Only one prototype was built, but it crashed on its maiden flight. The F6 was just a design that didn't go to production, but foreshadowed many features that later appeared on the F8 variant. The T7 was a two-seater trainer variant. The F8 was the top-of-the-line version of the Meteor, with a longer fuselage, new tail section from the earlier mentioned Gloster E144 Ace prototype, and featuring the new Rolls-Royce Derwent 8 engines. This variant came standard with an ejection seat. One of the F8 Meteors was used as a prone pilot testbed to test a different pilot position. The FR9 was an armed reconnaissance version of the F8. 126 were built. The PR-10 was a high-altitude photo-reconnaissance version. And finally, the NF11-14 variants were night fighter versions, with a longer nose to fit the radar. The Meteor used two Rolls-Royce Derwent 8 turbojet engines, each of them producing 3,600 pounds of thrust. With these engines, it had a maximum speed of 600 miles an hour at 10,000 feet, a range of 600 miles, and a service ceiling of 43,000 feet. The main armament consisted of 4 20mm Hispano cannons, and it could carry either up to 16 RP-3 rockets or 2,000-pound bombs. The first Meteors entered service in July 1944 with the RAF 616 Squadron, and flew their first combat mission on 27th the same month. The Meteor was considered top secret at that point, and they were not allowed on missions over the continent, only over Britain. They were used mainly to counter the V-1 buzz bombs, and achieved their first kill on 4th of August. A few months later, in October, the squadron was moved to Debden Airfield to participate in exercises with the US Army Air Force bombers to work out tactics against German jet fighters. For a week they were running mock-up attack missions against B-24 and B-17 bomber formations. Finally, in January 1945, the RAF decided to deploy the Meteors on the continent, and they were sent to Belgium. But they were still restricted to air defense roles, as they were forbidden to fly over German-controlled territory to avoid any potential loss of aircraft, which could be captured by the Germans, or the Soviets for that matter. Later they were used in ground attack roles, and by the end of the war destroyed 46 German aircrafts on the ground. In April they suffered their first losses, but not to enemy fire. 2 Meteors collided midair because of poor visibility. Actually, the already weak German Air Force was not a big threat to these planes, but many times Allied anti-aircraft batteries opened fire on them, as they couldn't identify the new type of aircraft. To avoid any friendly fire incidents, all the Meteors stationed on the continent were painted white. After the war, several more squadrons were equipped with Meteors, and the new F4 variant was exported to many countries, including Argentina, where they saw combat during the 1955 rebellion. The Meteors saw use during the Korean War as well, used by the Australian Air Force. Though they were outmatched by the new Soviet MiG-15 fighters, they managed to gather a few kills, but their losses were high, so later they were relegated to ground attack duties. They participated in the Suez Crisis on the Middle East as well, and were used by all sides, Israel, Egypt and Syria. The French Air Force also used the Meteors in the 1950s, and they participated in the Algerian War. With the RAF, the Meteors remained in service until 1957, when they were replaced by the Gloster Javelin. Though the Gloster Meteor was not as glamorous as the more famous Me-262, it was a more forgiving aircraft, easier to fly and much more reliable. Nowadays the Me-262 is much more widely known, but still the Meteor was a milestone in aviation, and stayed in service for years after World War II, And who knows, if the war lasts longer, maybe these two jet fighters could have met in the skies above Europe. Chapter 7. The Messerschmitt Me 262. To understand the origins of the Me 262, we need to go back to the pre-war years, the 1930s, when jet engine development first got to the point when they were actually usable. Well before World War II, engineers were concerned that the propeller-driven planes will reach their limits soon because of the propeller's efficiency. Although even up to the end of World War II, the propeller-driven plane designs kept getting faster and better, it was clear they will reach the end of their life soon. The first jet engine designs were kind of hybrids, where the air compressor was driven by an external piston engine, as opposed to a real jet engine where the compressor is driven by the engine itself. A good example for these early hybrid experiments is the Caproni Campini N1. The first actual patent for an engine using a gas turbine was filed in 1921, but that engine was never built. The man known as pioneer for the jet engine was Frank Whittle, who had the idea for a turbojet engine in 1928 and submitted his patent in 1930. About the same time when Frank Whittle was working on his turbojet engine in Britain, there were similar experiments in Germany by Hans von Wachin. His first working jet engine was running in September 1937, just 6 months after Whittle's. A version of this engine powered the world's first jet aircraft, the Heinkel HE 178, in August 1939, just a few weeks before the invasion of Poland. Encouraged by the successful tests, the Germans started working on the idea of an advanced combat aircraft powered by jet engines. Unlike the British, who at the beginning neglected Whittle's jet engine, the Germans were very interested in the new technology. Because it only appeared at the end of the war, many think it was just one of the last attempts on their weapons. But actually the Me 262, under the name Project 1065, was already under development before the beginning of World War II. The main goal for the project was to create a jet-powered aircraft capable of speeds above 850 km an hour. By mid-1939, the first design was drawn up and submitted. It was slightly different from the final design, but not by much. The biggest difference being the first design featured wing root mounted engines instead of engine pods under the wings. Not a well-known fact, but by this time the Germans had a jet fighter in a much more advanced stage. It was the Heinkel HE 280, which by September 1940 was in a stage where the first airframe was already completed. The main problem with the Heinkel plane was, as expected, the engines. Heinkel tried to build his own jet engines in-house by employing Hans von Wachin. However, the engine development was well behind the projected pace, and through 1940 and 1941 the plane's test flights were mainly done in glider mode. There were even proposals to use the pulse jet engines from the V1 rockets on the aircraft. Finally, at the end of 1942, the HE 280 demonstrated itself with jet engines against the Focke-Wulf 190. The test showed that it was a lot faster than the propeller-driven fighter. But the engine problem still delayed the Heinkel project. Finally, in 1943, the aircraft was tested with the UMO jet engines and worked well enough. But the UMO engines were much bigger and heavier than the ones the plane was designed for, so this prototype was much slower than the Me 262. In March 1943, Heinkel was ordered to stop the project, as the ministry didn't want two competing designs for the limited number of jet engines. So after this little detour, back to the Me 262 development. As opposed to the first plan, later the engines were moved out to the engine pods under the wings. This was important for easier access, as the early jet engines were not exactly durable. The engine development and manufacturing during the war continued to be the biggest problem for the jet fighter project. Many high-ranking officials were convinced the war could be won easily with conventional aircraft. Hermann Göring cut back the jet engine development program to just 35 engineers. Don't forget, we are talking about the first half of the war, when Germany ruled most of Europe and confidence was all-time high. The Me 262 is known as the first swept-wing fighter aircraft, though the swept wing was not actually in the initial plans. The main reason the plane had swept wings was because the jet engines were heavier than originally planned. To keep the weight in the correct position, the wings were swept back, so the airframe doesn't need to be modified to move the whole wing further back. On the first 5 prototypes, only the outer edge of the wings were swept, and the inner part between the fuselage and the engine nacelles remained straight. Later wing tunnel tests showed the advantage of a full swept design, so from the V6 prototype onwards, all models have the signature 18.5 degree swept wings. Test flights began on 18th of April 1941 with the V1 prototype, although jet engines were not ready at the time, so a conventional piston engine was installed in the nose. This conventional engine was still retained after the jet engines were installed, and this saved the prototype actually when in a test flight both jets flamed out. The first only jet-powered flight came with the V3 prototype on 18th of July 1942. This is the flight you see in the background footage. Those of you who are familiar with the Me-262 probably noticed that the plane in the footage has a tailwheel. Up until the V4 prototype, all the Me-262s were built with a conventional tailwheel setup. This was found to be a problem as the jet exhaust deflected up from the runway and interfered with the elevators on takeoff. On the V5 model they switched to a fixed tricycle landing gear, and on the V6 to a fully retractable tricycle gear setup. This was then retained all the way in production. Test flights continued over the coming years, but the problems with the jet engines slowed down the project considerably. Germany had a shortage of metals needed to withstand the extreme heat and pressure in the jet engines, so early engines were so short-lived they often only lasted for one flight. Although the airframe was basically ready by 1942, the lack of engines available prevented mass production until 1944. To overcome this, German engineers changed most of the air materials in the engines to mild steel with aluminum coating. With this they simplified production, but it was a big compromise as the turbines in the engines only lasted for about 30 hours. The Me-262 featured two Junkers Jumo 004B turbojet engines. The aircraft had a maximum speed of 900 km an hour, which equals approximately 560 miles an hour. This was more than 100 miles an hour more than most Allied fighter aircrafts of the time were capable of. The P-51 had a maximum speed of 710 km an hour, and the P-47 could reach only 686 km an hour. The Me-262 had a cruise speed of 465 miles an hour, and even this was higher than the maximum speed of most propeller-driven fighters of World War II. The plane's maximum range was 650 miles, though because of the engine's high fuel consumption and inconsistency, a low fuel warning light was installed to warn the pilot if the remaining fuel is below 250 liters. The service ceiling was 37,570 feet. The Me-262's speed and climb rate was very impressive at that time and came as a shock to the Allied pilots. The armament on the fighter was equally impressive. It featured four 30mm Mk108 cannons installed in the nose. This was a devastating weapon. A few of its rounds could tear off the wing of a B-17 or blow a smaller aircraft to pieces. The A2 fighter bomber version only featured two cannons, but could be equipped with 250 or 500 kg bombs. There were several experiments to utilize the Me-262 for various roles, so let's take a look at the most interesting ones. The 1A/U4 was a proposed bomber tankbuster version with a 50mm cannon in the nose. The Me-262B2 was a proposed night fighter version with a stretched fuselage. The A1/U3 was a reconnaissance version. As the Me-262 only arrived at the end of the war, its operation history wasn't too long. A test unit was set up in April 1944 to train pilots and introduce the plane into service. The actual operational missions for the Me-262 started in August 1944. During the second half of the year, the new jet started to fly combat missions, but not in large scale, as the Luftwaffe was still in the process of working out fighter tactics for the new planes and setting up units. Because of the speed of the Me-262, the pilots needed new tactics to attack bomber formations, as their speed difference was too big for accurate shooting, especially in a head-on attack. A favored method became a shallow dive from the rear below the formation, then pulling up to attack from below, then turn away. The first dedicated bomber unit using the 2A variant fighter bombers was set up in January 1945. They didn't manage to achieve any big results, but lost 12 planes in a short time. It was in March 1945 when these new jets were first used in large scale. On 18th of March, 37 Me-262s attacked the formation of more than 1200 bombers. They claimed 13 kills against the loss of 3 Me-262s. Though they were successful planes and had a good kill ratio, because of their low numbers at this stage of the war, they barely made an impact. During the last days of the war, the Me-262s were mainly directed to ground attack role against the Red Army, just outside Berlin. They claimed several ground targets and aircraft kills, but it was too little, too late. After the end of World War II, the Allied countries tried to gather as much of the advanced German technologies as they could. During Operation Lusty, many of the Me-262s and other German aircraft were confiscated and shipped to the US for evaluation. During the testing they found the Me-262 was faster than the Gloster Meteor, had better visibility, and it was a more stable gun platform, but its engine was less reliable. Even compared to the P-80 Shooting Star, they found that the German plane had better acceleration and speed. From the test they got many innovative ideas, for example the slats on the F-86 Sabre were based on the Me-262s. Czechoslovakia produced Me-262s after World War II, and they were the first aircraft of their air force. They stayed in service until 1951, when Soviet fighters replaced them. The Me-262 was a big jump in aviation technology, and influenced several post-war designs, like the Sukhoi Su-9, the F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15, and even the B-47 Stratojet. Chapter 8. The Heinkel HE 112R. Before and during World War II, the German scientists were fascinated by rocket-powered flight, and over the years they applied the rocket boosters to many different uses. Apart from the well-known rockets like the V2, and the less-known ones like the Butterfly, and in fighter aircrafts like the Me-163, they were also used as assisting engines on the huge Me-321 gliders and on bombers too. In parallel to Werner von Braun's rocket experiments, the other well-known development was the rocket boosters for different planes manufactured by Helmut Walter's company. They developed a series of reusable rocket boosters, which were tested and used on many different aircraft over the years. Both Walter and Braun were involved in a project that took place in the 1930s, and its goal was to test the rocket propulsion on aircrafts. More specifically, to test the theory if a tail-mounted rocket or jet engine could work, or as many believed at that time, it would flip the aircraft. At first von Braun met with opposition in the Reich Air Ministry, but Ernst Heinkel saw potential in the tests, as he himself was very interested in the jet propulsion. Heinkel actually employed Hans von Ohain in 1936, who was the German pioneer of jet engine development. So Heinkel first provided a HE-112 fuselage for the testing, and von Braun set to work to install the rocket engine in the tail of the aircraft. After the first engine tests, Heinkel provided a full aircraft for the flight tests. The RLM at this point allowed the team to use a reserve airfield east of Berlin, so the test project moved to Neuhardenberg in 1937. After several months of testing the engine on the standing testbed, finally in June 1937, Erich Warsitz took the plane for its first flight. The flight proved the concept is working, although he landed with the fuselage on fire from the heat of the rocket booster. The RLM wanted another type of rocket to be tested, so they asked Helmut Walter to build an engine for the test plane as well. The Walter engine proved to be safer, so the later flights were conducted using this type. The aircraft performed several test flights during 1937, and the project was concluded at the end of the year, when all rocket-powered experiments were moved to Peenemünde. This experiment was only meant to show that the rocket propulsion works in planes, and it succeeded. Later these experiences were used in other designs, like the Messerschmitt Me-163. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.